Hey guys, welcome back to the course, and if this is the first video you're seeing, you should definitely go back and watch everything up till this point in the course, because we are finally getting to the point where we are going to put pencil to paper and start getting our garden plans actually out here into a physical form. So like I said at the beginning of this course, this is definitely an in-depth planning, and we are not about to do all of it all at once in this one video, but we are going to get started with our gardening sketches. We're going to be starting to figure out exactly how much space we have to plant and what that space actually can do for us as far as the conditions it's providing for our plants. So go ahead and grab a mug of something delicious, grab your garden planner if you haven't already, or your notebook, whatever it is that you're using, and we will get started. So the first thing I want you to do is to go outside and take a look at your space, and then take some measurements if you can. Now, this definitely doesn't have to be perfect. Rough estimations are absolutely fine, but we do need like a number in our heads as we're going forward, and then as we're filling in this sketch with eventually the plants that we're going to be planting. So while you're outside looking around at your space, these are the things that I want you to look for and then include in your drawing. So I want the total size of your space kind of just roughly mapped out. You can, put a little icon for your house. You can do backyard, side yard, front yard, whatever it is that you're going to be planting in. And I want you to start drawing in, to take note of, so you can draw in later, anything like trees, fences, walls, steps for your porch, things like that. And as you are looking at your space, I also want you to consider if there is a slope anywhere. For my yard specifically, almost my entire yard from front to back has a slope. And so that's something that I'm considering when I'm building my garden and deciding what I'm planting where. And when we're talking about slope, it could be anything from like just kind of a low spot in your yard where you know that the water kind of collects when it rains. It could be drainage that is intentionally sloped a certain way away from the house. Or it could be like me where you're on a hill. And if you are on a pretty extreme incline in any area that you want to plant in, I want you to consider whether or not you're going to take the time to kind of flatten out where you're going to be planting, or if you're going to try and plant on the slope. Some plants will grow fine on a slope. They'll still grow straight up out of that slope. But the steeper the slope, the more difficult it will be to make sure that rain isn't washing everything away, to make sure that you can actually comfortably exist in that space as you're planting, etc., things like that. So just keep that in mind as you are outside looking at your space, and then I want you to come inside with me and start drawing. All right, so my garden is so large, I'm actually probably going to need multiple pages, but I will do my main garden on this page as a demonstration for you. So my main garden, it is in ground, and it is like roughly square, okay? So I've got this big, large square of a garden right here. I know it's approximately 30 by 30 feet. That is variable, depends how far out to the edge I care to plant, but it's about 30 by 30. And like I said, this does not have to be super exact, right? And so when I'm looking at this big in-ground area that I'm wanting to grow in, one of the first things, like I said, we're thinking about where the trees are. I know that off the page here, I have a big tree right here, and it shades like a good portion of the garden these days. So I'm gonna go ahead and kind of fill in the fact that this whole section of garden is gonna be pretty shady at certain points of the day. Definitely noon sun versus morning sun versus evening sun is gonna be a little bit different, but I know over here, this is gonna be way shadier because it's closer to the tree. And then these outer edges are less and less shady because they are shaded for less time as the sun is moving around. Something else important to note as you are looking outside that I forgot to mention earlier is which direction south is. So this way is south for me, and this way is about north. I am in the northern hemisphere, which means that the sun is always slightly to the south as it's going from east to west. So my east is roughly this way, west roughly this way. So my sun comes up somewhere over here, kind of travels that direction across the sky, and then sets somewhere over here. And so when you're thinking about where you want to plant your garden, if you have a lot of options, you're probably going to want to, if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're going to want to choose something that's on the south side of your house so that your house isn't shading most of the sun. And then if you're in the southern hemisphere, you've got the opposite. You're going to want a more northern facing section of your yard so that a big structure like your house isn't shading out the vast majority of your garden. Now, the next thing, we were talking about slopes and low spots. So I actually have a slope in my garden that goes kind of this direction. This side is higher than this side. So something that I did when I was first designing my garden is I actually put in a swale right here, which is just a fancy word for a ditch. And what I did was I dug the dirt out of the ditch, and then I mounded it into a little bit of a hill right here, right on the edge of the garden. And what that did is that actually stops the water that is coming down this hill towards the garden from just rushing across the garden and washing away my mulch. I've had that multiple times happen over the years. It's a lot better now that I have the swale. I've had to deepen the swale because once or twice a year we get an absolute flood of rain that will wash things away if I'm not careful. So this is one of my considerations for the slope. The other thing I know about my garden is kind of in this general area, I have a low spot. This is, I'm told by the neighbors, where an old well was and was filled in. And so this area, the dirt is just constantly sinking and settling. And so I filled it in before, but it still settles a bit. And so I know that anything that I plant in like this general area of the garden is going to have what we call wet feet. The soil is always going to be a little bit more damp and soggy in this general vicinity. And some plants like that, some plants hate that, but we got to take that into consideration. All right, and then we have to talk about structures. So for me, I have porch stairs that kind of come down this way, and the edge of my house is here. Because I am on the south side of the house right here, the house doesn't really shade the garden at all. And the stairs also are not really shading the garden. If you were going to be planting by your porch, right, and doing something like this, then you might have to consider whether or not your porch steps are actually going to be shading out the spot where you're going to be planting. But for me, that's not really an issue. Something else that is a bit more advanced, but I think you guys can handle, is the fact that as fall starts to happen, this tree actually defoliates, right? It drops all its leaves, and suddenly it's not shading nearly as much as it does in the summer. And so that means that I can actually plant more sun-loving stuff in this area in the fall than I can over the summer. And so that's just another consideration to keep in your head as you are making this drawing and moving on into the further steps of this course. All right, so now that I have kind of the general gist of the environment that I'm working in, now I'm going to start putting in where garden beds are going to go versus where pathways are going to go. The way I currently have my garden set up, which I'm not going to argue is the best way to set up this space, but please do note that even though I'm not doing it the most efficient way possible, it's still very productive. So definitely don't get in your head about choosing perfectly here. But the way I currently have it set up is I have 4 main rows with walkways in between, kind of like this. And then at the back there, I have kind of a whole row of plants here. Right here, we've got, maybe we will crosshatch this for walkway. And something else to consider as you're going through, if you are planting in raised beds and you're building them yourself, or if you are setting up rows, kind of like I am, this distance right here from edge to edge, I don't recommend making it any bigger than 4 feet. If it's more than 4 feet wide, you're gonna have trouble standing on the side and reaching whatever is in the middle. 4 feet is kind of the sweet spot for that. 3.5, a little bit more comfortable, but 4 feet, I would not go above 4 feet wide for your rows. And then when you're thinking about how wide to make your paths, if you are planning on mowing in between your paths, if you're putting up raised beds or something like that, make sure your mower can fit in here. Or if you are going to be bringing in mulch or soil or whatever, make sure this is at least wide enough for a wheelbarrow or your cart or whatever it is that you're going to be needing to get in between these different rows. So now that I'm looking at this, I can see this first row right here. It's almost entirely shaded the whole time during the summer. And this row is going to be partially shaded throughout most of the summer. So shade-loving plants can go here. Things that can tolerate a little bit of shade can go here. And then these 2 rows are actually the only 2 big rows I have for plants that are going to need full sun. And then I also have this section kind of here, which can also hold plants that need full sun. This area, just a touch shady, but really not too bad. So like I said, this absolutely does not have to be perfect. This is just one of the many drafts of our garden plan that we are going to be making. This one has a lot of information on it already, so we will be referring back to it quite a bit, but we are going to be making more drawings as we go along that are going to give us more specific information about which plants go where and things like that. So if you haven't been following along this whole time, your homework is to go ahead and fill out your drawing in your notebook. And as we come into the next lesson, we're going to actually start making a finalized list of all the plants that we are going to be putting in our garden. And then from there, we're going to be moving into how exactly we are going to fit them into this space that we just sketched out. So do your homework, and I will see you in the next video.